In the late 1970s, inside secure offices scattered across the Soviet military-industrial world, a quiet conclusion settled in long before the evidence was complete. The Americans, it was decided, had lost their way. The signs seemed obvious to those trained to see weakness as excess. Too much money, too much comfort, too much faith in machines that would never survive real war. When reports about a new American-made battle tank began circulating, heavy turbine-powered, saturated with electronics, the reaction was not alarm. It was dismissal. Soviet armored culture had been forged in catastrophe. Kursk, the Eastern Front, the endless arithmetic of loss and replacement. Their tanks were not built to be admired. They were built to exist in numbers large enough to absorb destruction and continue moving. A tank was a tool, not a sanctuary. Crews were inputs. Survival was not a design requirement. Momentum was. From that worldview, the American approach looked irrational. Why build a tank that weighed more than 50 tons when bridges failed and mud swallowed vehicles whole? Why rely on a gas turbine that drank fuel like an aircraft in a world where logistics collapsed first? Why protect crews with thick armor and redundant systems when doctrine assumed they would not live long enough to need them? The answers offered by Western analysts, precision, survivability, information, were not taken seriously. Those concepts did not align with how the Red Army understood war. To Soviet planners, combat was resolved by force concentration and speed. Whoever arrived first with the most steel won. Technology mattered, but only insofar as it could be produced quickly and used by mentally trained soldiers. The American tank seemed to reject all of that. It was tall, loud, complex, expensive. Everything Soviet design philosophy worked to avoid. Reports emphasized its vulnerabilities. Electronics would fail under shock. Optics would be blinded by smoke and dust. Maintenance would cripple operations. The turbine would announce its presence and tether the tank to supply convoys begging to be destroyed. On balance sheets and doctrinal charts, the Abrams looked like a liability. What Soviet analysts believed they were evaluating was a vehicle. What they were actually misreading was intent. The United States was not trying to win the same war. It was preparing to fight a different one entirely. NATO planners had reached a conclusion the Soviets could not accept. Mass could not be matched. The Warsaw Pact would always have more tanks, more artillery, more men. Any attempt to mirror that approach would fail. The only viable response was to make every engagement unequal. That meant seeing first, shooting first, killing at ranges where return fire was impossible. It meant designing a tank not as a disposable unit in a flood, but as a node in a network of information, sensors, and trained judgment. None of that showed up clearly in intelligence summaries. Paper did not capture what happens when one crew can detect another long before being detected themselves. It did not convey what it means when fire control eliminates guesswork, when training emphasizes initiative instead of obedience, when survival is not an afterthought, but a prerequisite for sustained lethality. To Soviet doctrine, war was an equation of inputs and outputs. Tanks went in, territory came out, losses were expected and replaced. The Abrams did not fit that math, so it was treated as an error. The mistake was not technical. It was conceptual. By assuming the Americans were building a worse version of a Soviet tank, Soviet planners blinded themselves to the possibility that the Americans were redefining what a tank was meant to do. They mistook protection for fear, complexity for fragility, and expense for decadence. In reality, they were watching the early shape of a system designed to dismantle everything they believed about armored warfare. The danger was not that the Abrams was misunderstood. The danger was that it was understood just enough to be dismissed, and that dismissal would calcify into doctrine, training, and expectation. When the test finally arrived, it would not be a debate between theories. It would be a collision between vision and reality, and only one of them had prepared for that moment. While American engineers were still refining the Abrams, the Soviet armor machine moved forward with absolute certainty. There was no debate in Moscow about how the next war would be fought. The answer already existed, written in doctrine, rehearsed in exercises, and burned into institutional memory. War would be fast, war would be violent, and war would be won by mass. This belief was not arrogance, It was inheritance. The Red Army had survived annihilation once before. In 1941, it lost millions of men and tens of thousands of tanks, yet still crushed the Wehrmacht through scale alone. That trauma became truth. Individual excellence was irrelevant. Technology mattered only if it could be produced endlessly. Victory belonged to the side that could replace losses faster than the enemy could inflict them. By the Cold War, this idea hardened into gospel. Soviet tank doctrine did not imagine heroic crews or long duels. Tanks were tools, not knights. Crews were interchangeable. If a battalion lost half its vehicles taking a NATO position, that was acceptable as long as the position fell. Survival was not a requirement. Momentum was. The T-72 embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was low, cheap, fast to manufacture, and brutally simple. Its auto-loader eliminated the need for a fourth crewman. Its armor was good enough. Its optics were basic but serviceable. Everything unnecessary was stripped away. What remained was a weapon optimized for one task, advancing west in overwhelming numbers. Training reflected this mindset. Crews were drilled on procedures, not improvisation. Engagements were expected to be close, chaotic, and brief. Soviet planners assumed that NATO tanks would be spotted visually, engaged quickly, and destroyed through volume of fire. If one T-72 failed, 5 more would follow. This worldview shaped how Soviet intelligence interpreted the Abrams. They did not see a threat. They saw a deviation. American insistence on crew survivability looked inefficient. Advanced optics looked fragile. Heavy armor looked slow. Electronics looked vulnerable. The Abrams appeared to be designed for a battlefield that did not exist, one where tanks waited, aimed carefully, and fought individually. To Soviet analysts, this was proof of misunderstanding. Americans, they believed, were building a tank for peacetime demonstrations and defensive posturing, not for the brutal realities of mechanized war. What they missed was the most dangerous idea of all. The Abrams was not built to endure Soviet doctrine. It was built to break it. American planners accepted a hard truth early. NATO could not win a numbers game. Even perfect defense would eventually collapse under mass. So instead of trying to absorb Soviet strength, they aimed to make that strength irrelevant. The Abrams was designed around information dominance. Where Soviet doctrine assumed mutual visibility, the Abrams assumed asymmetry. Where Soviet tactics relied on closing distance, the Abrams was built to kill from farther away. Where Soviet tanks treated night, smoke, and weather as obstacles, the Abrams treated them as weapons. This difference never appeared in Soviet reports. Paper could show armor thickness. It could list engine types. It could estimate speed and fuel consumption. What it could not show was tempo, the speed at which decisions were made and executed. It could not show what happened when one side saw first, aimed first, and fired first. Soviet doctrine assumed parity. Abrams' doctrine assumed inequality. As the 1980s progressed, the gap widened quietly. Soviet tank forces grew larger, but not smarter. New models refined the same assumptions. Better armor, bigger guns, slightly improved optics. The core belief remained untouched. War would be decided by mass and courage. Meanwhile, American crews trained obsessively. Gunnery tables, night engagements, hunter-killer drills. Crews practiced fighting while moving, fighting while blinded, fighting while outnumbered. They did not train to survive the Soviet assault. They trained to dismantle it. By the time the Cold War began to crack, both sides were ready for war, but not the same war. One believed history guaranteed victory. The other believed history had changed. The test would not come in Europe. It would come where doctrine had nowhere to hide. The decisive edge of the Abrams was never meant to be seen. From the outside, it was just another tank, larger than most, louder than some, burdened with strange equipment and unfamiliar complexity. To Soviet analysts, its advantages appeared theoretical, fragile, conditional. But inside the Abrams, the battlefield was being rewritten in ways their doctrine had never prepared for. Soviet tanks fought the war their crews could see. Visibility defined everything. If you could not see the enemy, you closed the distance. If night fell, you waited. If smoke covered the field, you advanced cautiously or stopped entirely. Even with infrared systems, darkness was compromised. Active illumination revealed the enemy, but also betrayed the user. Every tank lit the night like a signal flare. Darkness was not safety. It was mutual blindness. The Abrams ended that balance. Its thermal sights did not shine outward. They listened. They absorbed heat silently and translated it into vision. Engines burned white-hot. Tracks glowed faintly. Recently disturbed ground held warmth like fingerprints. Smoke, fog, rain, and night became irrelevant. To an Abrams crew, the battlefield was never dark. This was not just better vision. It was asymmetry. The first time an Abrams crew trained exclusively at night, something unsettling happened. Engagements became effortless. Targets appeared before the crew expected them. Range estimation vanished. The gun did not search. It snapped. Fire commands shortened instinct. Crews realized they were no longer reacting. They were initiating. That shift mattered more than armor or firepower. Soviet doctrine assumed that tanks would find each other roughly at the same time. Abrams' doctrine assumed the opposite. The tank was built around the idea that the enemy should already be dying before he understood he had been detected. This advantage multiplied through tempo. In Soviet tanks, the commander observed, then directed the gunner, then waited for the turret to align. In the Abrams, the commander hunted independently, while the gunner engaged one target. The commander searched for the next. When he found it, he pressed a button. The turret snapped. The gunner was already aligned. Seconds disappeared. Those seconds were the difference between a duel and an execution. Fire control systems did the rest. Laser rangefinders erased guesswork. Wind sensors corrected drift automatically. Barrel distortion, ammunition temperature, vehicle movement, all calculated instantly. The gunner did not walk rounds. He fired once. Against older tanks, this was impressive. Against Soviet tanks, it was catastrophic. AT-72 crew needed time to identify a target, estimate range, adjust aim, fire, observe impact, and correct. Each step exposed them. Each second increased risk. Against the Abrams, that entire process happened after they were already being targeted. The Abrams did not outshoot Soviet tanks. It outpaced them. Even movement obeyed a different logic. Soviet tanks advanced methodically, conserving fuel, maintaining formation, waiting for orders. The Abrams surged when needed, stopped when needed, and repositioned constantly. The turbine engine, once mocked, allowed instant acceleration. Ambushes were brief and violent. Shots were fired, positions changed, and return fire arrived at empty ground. To Soviet doctrine, this behavior looked chaotic. To Abrams crews, it was control. The battlefield was no longer a shared space. It was segmented by awareness. One side operated inside a continuous picture. The other fought in fragments. This was the invisible advantage. Sensors turning chaos into clarity, clarity into tempo, and tempo into dominance. None of it showed up clearly in intelligence reports. Thermal imaging was dismissed as unreliable. Electronics were assumed fragile. Training advantages were considered temporary. Soviet planners believed that once war began, friction would equalize everything. They were wrong. Friction punished the blind. It rewarded the aware. By the late 1980s, the Abrams was no longer just a tank. It was a system that compressed observation, decision, and action into a single motion. It did not wait for permission from the battlefield. It imposed its own rhythm. All that was missing was proof. Not in simulations, not in Europe, but in a place where night, distance, and confusion would strip away every illusion and reveal what invisible advantages really meant. Soviet tank warfare had been designed for a very specific war. Europe, narrow corridors, mass formations, short, violent engagements decided by numbers and momentum. Speed mattered, but only inside a system where everyone saw the battlefield the same way. The M1 Abrams entered combat and broke that assumption instantly. When the first Abrams units rolled into real combat conditions, they didn't behave like Soviet doctrine predicted. They didn't rush forward in dense spearheads. They didn't pause to consolidate after contact. They didn't rely on visual confirmation or command permission to act. They hunted. Abrams' crews fought dispersed, coordinated by data rather than proximity. Tanks were separated by kilometers, not meters, yet functioned as a single organism. One platoon fixed the enemy. Another flanked without ever being seen. Fire arrived before Soviet-designed crews even understood they were engaged. This was not a clash of machines. It was a clash of assumptions. Soviet doctrine treated tanks as breakthrough instruments, shock tools meant to punch holes for follow-on forces. Abrams treated the battlefield as a sensor web. Every engagement was shaped before the first shot was fired. The goal was not penetration. The goal was annihilation before response. Enemy crews reported something deeply unsettling. They were being hit without ever seeing what fired on them. At ranges Soviet tanks considered safe, Abrams rounds were landing with surgical precision. At night, when Soviet doctrine expected operational pauses, Abrams units accelerated. Engagements happened faster than reports could move up the chain of command. By the time orders came back down, the battlefield had already changed. And then came the most devastating realization. Even when Soviet-designed tanks fired first, it didn't matter. Abrams' armor absorbed hits that should have crippled older designs. Crews stayed operational. Fire control systems recalculated. Return fire was immediate and final. Soviet doctrine assumed mutual vulnerability. Abrams introduced asymmetric survivability. One side lost tanks. The other lost the fight. Command structures collapsed under this pressure. Soviet-style centralized control could not adapt to a battlefield where decisions had to be made in seconds by crews on the ground. Abrams' crews didn't wait. They acted. Doctrine became instinct. Training replaced instruction. This wasn't bravery. It was system supremacy. The Abrams didn't just win engagements. It erased predictability. Soviet planners had built their entire armor philosophy around expectations. Expected detection ranges, expected kill probabilities, expected reaction times. Abrams violated every one of them simultaneously. Night was no longer neutral ground. Distance was no longer protection. Numbers were no longer decisive. And once that realization spread, the psychological damage was irreversible. Tank crews began to hesitate. Hesitation in armored warfare is fatal. Soviet doctrine punished initiative. Abrams rewarded it. Where Soviet crews waited for orders, Abrams' crews exploited gaps. Where Soviet formations tried to regroup, Abrams' units were already repositioning. The battlefield tempo belonged to one side only. What made this moment decisive was not a single battle, but the implication. If Abrams could do this in limited engagements, it meant the entire Soviet armor concept was obsolete the moment it faced a fully realized Western system. Not outnumbered, outclassed. The Cold War had assumed a catastrophic clash of massed armor. Abrams proved such a clash would never happen as imagined. One side would arrive late, blind and already burning. Soviet tank warfare hadn't failed because of bad crews or weak machines. It failed because it was built for a world that no longer existed. A world where seeing meant knowing, where mass meant power, where night meant pause. Abrams turned the battlefield into a place where none of those rules applied. And once that door was opened, it could never be closed again. By the time the implications were fully understood, it was already too late. Soviet tank warfare did not collapse in a single explosion or a dramatic last stand. It unraveled quietly, inside the minds of planners, commanders, and crews who realized that the rules they had trained under no longer protected them. For decades, Soviet armor doctrine had relied on certainty. Certainty of mass. Certainty of escalation. Certainty that if enough steel moved forward, something would break. Abrams introduced uncertainty at every level. Tank crews trained under Soviet systems were conditioned to expect symmetry. If you were in range, the enemy was in range. If you could see them, they could see you. If you fired, they fired back. Combat was brutal, but understandable. Abrams shattered that psychological balance. Crews began entering combat already disadvantaged. They knew, before engines even turned, that the enemy could see farther, shoot straighter, react faster, and survive longer. That knowledge poisoned decision-making. Confidence eroded. Aggression hesitated. And in armored warfare, hesitation is lethal. Reports from training exercises and combat simulations revealed a chilling pattern. Once Abrams units were detected, Soviet-style crews often assumed they were already being targeted. Maneuvers became defensive before contact was made. Formations tightened instead of dispersing. Speed slowed. Initiative vanished. Doctrine had trained them to obey. The battlefield now demanded adaptation. Abrams crews, by contrast, operated with psychological momentum. They trusted their systems. They trusted each other. They trusted that the first shot would be theirs, and that it would end the engagement. That belief matters more than armor thickness. When one side expects survival and the other expects loss, outcomes follow predictably. This imbalance spread upward. Commanders realized their carefully planned timelines were meaningless against an enemy who fought at a different tempo. Engagements ended before reports were filed. Units disappeared before maps were updated. Decision cycles lagged behind reality. The battlefield no longer waited for permission. Soviet doctrine had been designed to control chaos. Abrams turned chaos into a weapon. Every unanswered question multiplied fear. How many tanks were out there? Where were they? Were they already repositioning? Was this contact a feint, or the main strike? Without reliable answers, commanders defaulted to caution. Caution cost ground. Ground cost momentum. Momentum cost wars. This wasn't just a technical defeat. It was an identity crisis. Soviet armored power had been a symbol of inevitability. Massive parades. Endless columns. Steel without end. Abrams reduced that image to something fragile. A force that must see itself as unstoppable cannot function once it doubts itself. Western analysts noticed something unprecedented. The deterrent balance had shifted without a treaty being signed or a shot being fired in anger between superpowers. The mere existence of Abrams-class systems forced reevaluation at every level of Soviet military planning. Exercises were rewritten, assumptions abandoned, confidence quietly withdrawn. And yet, there was no solution. Matching Abrams required more than a new tank. It required new training, new command philosophy, new logistics, new industrial standards, new electronics infrastructure, and a cultural shift toward decentralized decision-making. That kind of transformation takes generations. The Cold War did not end because Abrams existed, but Abrams ensured how it could never be fought. By the late stages of the confrontation, Soviet tank warfare was no longer preparing to win. It was preparing to survive long enough to matter politically. That is a subtle but fatal change. A system designed to overwhelm had become a system designed to endure. And endurance is not dominance. The real destruction Abrams inflicted was invisible on the battlefield. It lived in revised manuals, canceled assumptions, quiet admissions, and a growing awareness that armored warfare had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. The machine did not just defeat tanks. It defeated belief. When the Cold War finally ended, there was no battlefield wreckage to examine. No smoking lines of destroyed formations stretching across Europe. No final armor clash to study. And that was the point. Soviet tank warfare had already lost. Without ever getting the war it was built for. The doctrine had been designed for a world where quantity could overpower quality, where speed of mobilization mattered more than precision, and where human cost was an acceptable variable. It assumed the battlefield would forgive inefficiency as long as momentum was maintained. Abrams made that assumption obsolete. Modern armored combat no longer rewarded mass alone. It punished it. Dense formations became targets. Rigid command structures became liabilities. Pre-planned routes became death corridors. The very principles that defined Soviet armored thinking now amplified its weaknesses. Attempts to adapt came too late. New tanks were proposed. Upgrades were rushed. Electronics were added in pieces, without the industrial ecosystem to support them. Training manuals changed language but not mindset. Command hierarchies remained centralized. Initiative was still something granted, not expected. You cannot retrofit philosophy. Abrams was not just a tank. It was a physical expression of a different way of thinking about war. A way that assumed chaos, empowered crews, prioritized information, and treated time as a decisive weapon. Soviet doctrine treated time as something to be endured. Abrams treated time as something to steal. Every second gained was a position taken. Every position taken was a fight avoided. Every avoided fight preserved momentum. That loop had no counter inside the old system. After the Soviet Union collapsed, its successor states inherited equipment, but not solutions. The same structural weaknesses remained. The same dependency on mass. The same vulnerability to technologically integrated forces. And every conflict since has confirmed it. Modern tank warfare now assumes what Abrams proved. If you cannot see first, shoot first, and move first, you are already losing. No army today plans armored operations the way Soviet doctrine once demanded. Even nations that cannot afford Abrams-level systems design around its logic. Sensors first. Networks first. Crew survivability first. Flexibility over rigidity. That shift is permanent. The most revealing detail is this. No modern armored force is trying to recreate Soviet-style mass tank assaults. They study them as warnings. What was once feared as unstoppable is now used as a case study in obsolescence. Abrams didn't destroy Soviet tank warfare with explosions. It destroyed it by making its future impossible. There was no dramatic announcement, no admission of defeat, just a gradual realization that the next war would not forgive old ideas and that the tools designed for the last one could not be trusted. That is how doctrines truly die, not when they lose a battle, but when they can no longer imagine winning the next one. The M1 Abrams did not end an era by force. It ended it by redefining reality.